Hello, my name is Jeremy Freeman. I'm the archaeologist for the Standing Rock THPO office, and today I'm going to go over how to make an atlatl and a dart. Now, an atlatl and a dart was an ancient hunting weapon that was used to basically project a missile, or in this case it was a 6-foot-long dart, at a greater velocity and greater force at prey. It was probably an innovation that was a very effective weapon as far as hunting by ancient people. The atlatl itself is basically just a stick, but it's going to have a little spur on the end. That's ultimately what we're going to need to make. And the dart will consist of, this is this river cane here. We're going to fletch it, so I have some feathers here that we're going to use for the fletching, and a projectile point here that we'll use for the tip. Other things that you'll need, artificial sinew, or real sinew if you can actually come across it, and a utility knife, and that'll be for making some of the modifications to our different, our atlatl here and our dart. And then a hot glue gun or some sort of other glue that you can use to adhere the fletching and the point tip here to your dart. We're also going to use the artificial sinew for that as well. So those are the items that you'll need for this activity. So the atlatl, generally you can use a natural stick that you can find. I usually like them to be right around about an inch and a half in diameter. Anything more than that, it's a little harder to grab, but it really depends on the size of your hand. Now, what I'm going to do is, this is just I just used a wood dowel here because it's relatively easy to obtain. All these items was either got from hardware store or Lowe's. Some of these came from Hobby Lobby. Some of these, like the points, you can order actually from Amazon. So to begin with, I'm going to start working on modifying the atlatl here, and I'm going to use the knife here to start whittling it down. Now, what I'd like to do, you get really, there's different styles of atlatls, and it really depends on what style you'd like and how ornate and how much effort you want to put into it. Ultimately, we just need a spur on the end. So I'm going to see really how hard this is actually to carve, because I'd like to actually thin it down a little bit, leaving a little spur or a little hook on the end here, and that's actually going to hook into the back end of our dart. And this will, as you can imagine, will take quite a while for me to whittle this down. So I'm going to start this process, and then get this, fast forward this here. Okay, so I've gotten it largely thinned down here. So what I need to start doing now is I need to create a spur at one end. And I've decided I'm going to use this end because I had a issue where it was gouging out here, but that's actually probably a good thing, because I'm going to need this area to be slightly lower in profile, because I have a spur here. I want this to be a little lower here so that it doesn't interfere with the dart when it's resting in the cradle of the atlatl here. So what I've done is I've just kind of carved out basically kind of a triangular piece here, and I'm just going to start carving away at the mass here. But I'm going to leave that so it'll actually be a little raised, and a little raised spur here on the end. And that is where the back end of our dart will go. So this is a little bit more delicate work here, because you don't want to accidentally remove that which you're needing to leave. You can also use, for that initial thinning part, you can actually use power tools as well. I've done that with an orbital sander. Will work for the initial thinning if you don't necessarily want to, use the time to actually carve it by hand. Of course, you can, it's a lot quicker, but you can also, of course, tell when it's been done by a power tool because it's a lot more regular, the surface. But you can get a really nice looking piece by doing that. And of course, you can do a pretty good job with doing it by hand as well. Just takes a little bit more time, I suppose, to that you invest in the care as far as how you want it to look. And it's just ultimately it's mostly just a preference, however you would like it to look. We definitely see a variety of different Atlals archaeologically, different styles. So that may have been just a conscious choice by the workman who is actually working the piece. So right now I'm just trying to be real careful here around where I want that little notch to be. I want to accidentally remove it. I'm going to undercut it slightly though because I want it to actually have a little bit of an area where it can actually basically rest inside the hollow end of that, the back end of that dart. And it doesn't necessarily need to be the most aesthetically pleasing piece, especially if it's your first one. It takes time to really kind of figure out how you what your preference is and how you want to actually what the final product is. So having a kind of an idea in your head of what you want it to look like is always, before you start, is always a good idea. So you can see I'm just removing the material here, right where this knock is going to be. I'll shape it up a little bit more when I get it a little bit better to find here. And if I had had more time, I would probably actually work on thinning this piece quite a bit more too. For the sake of time, I'm just calling it good right now, which this will work. This will work. I'm just going to give it a little bit of form here. Now I'm just working on undercutting it a little bit because I want that to protrude a little bit. Doesn't necessarily have to be a lot, just enough to catch the back end of that dart. course, this is just a really simple Atlal here. You can make, of course, one a little more ornate. Depending on how much time, of course, you want to invest in the process. And you can, of course, test it and see how well it'll work. So, probably want it to be just a little bit more. I mean, that would probably work, but I want it undercut just a little bit more than that. I want to really catch the back end of that dart. If you want, you can really thin this entire piece down if you want. You can make it flat as a board if you'd like. That's what I typically like to do. Right now I'm just going to work on getting it kind of thin enough, I think, for this demonstration. You can do some fine tuning and take out some of the ridges, the unevenness in the shaft here. I'm just going to thin it down here a little bit here, just a general idea, and then work, of course, undercutting this a little bit more. And sometimes you gotta really just get your knife in there and just kind of work it. Let's see what I'm doing here. I'm just kind of cutting up towards it here. Cutting up towards my spur, and then I'm angle cutting here underneath the where so I can get my spur to protrude a little bit here. So that's looking a lot better there. See how it's looking. So yeah, quite a bit better. So that definitely will catch it much better. Probably just a little bit more here, and I can probably do that largely by just modifying this. And sometimes I just keep cutting from different angles to remove some of that material. Gonna gouge out the wood a little bit here, and okay. So what I'm doing here is I started making a little spur here on the end, and what I'm doing is I've mostly thinned it out, and I like to get them relatively thin. They're a little bit easier to handle that way. They actually look a little bit better, I think. Some of it's more for aesthetics because it really actually doesn't matter too much. Actually, you know how the shaft is. It can be rounded. It can be flat. And what I'm doing here is I'm just taking out some, I'm gouging out this part here because ultimately you want this to be, you want this to be a little bit below your knock here, so your spur. That's so that the dart can rest in there relatively comfortably. I'm just going to thin it down just a little bit more. So you want to really undercut this spur here because you want the back end of the dart to actually rest in there, to sit in there pretty comfortably. So this river cane is going to be our dart. So you want it to actually be able to sit in there. So I just kind of carved out this triangular piece as I was thinning it and left that. So I was actually just removing the material around it and just started to shape it with my knife. So I had this kind of mental image of what this piece here was going to look like, just a triangular piece basically, so that we can carve it out and use it as part of our delivery system of the weapon. So it really just depends. I mean, you can, depends on how much time you really want to invest in it. You can of course use power tools. Power tools will of course help you thin it much quicker. They do also give you a little bit more of a regular surface here on your Atlal, if that's something you want to do. Of course, you know, traditionally, they would have, of course, would have had to use knives, and it would have been a significant amount of time that you would have invested in making your Atlal. Some of them are actually, this is really just a simple one here. Many of them that have been recovered from archaeological contexts are actually really stylish. So definitely a lot of time and effort was put into the production of this weapon. But basically all you really need is a spur on the end. It can really look however you like. You can even use a natural spur, a natural knot in the wood. I made an Atlal one time. I was looking to make a different one, but the knot was just kind of there, so I used it as part of my Atlal when I had made it. It was just kind of a knob just kind of sticking there. So I actually left it and used that as the spur. Just putting some finishing touches on this guy, so it looks somewhat aesthetically pleasing. And of course, there are some Atlals too that are actually kind of multi-component too, a multi-piece where you actually install an antler tine, a bone, or even another piece of wood or something. We actually adhere it to the drill a hole, and you actually insert it into the piece. So it doesn't necessarily have to be a single piece like this one. This is just one way, of course, of making an Atlal. And possibly this is one of the simplest ways, but certainly not the only. And there are as many ways to make an Atlal as there are creative minds out there. I was originally thinking, I think I'll probably forego it on this one, about thinking about cutting a well out here. So sometimes there's you see a triangular well, and maybe I'll start one here at least. And the reason for that is that it's just to raise up this this piece a little bit more so that you can get a little bit more grip on the back end of your dart. And so what I'm doing is I'm just removing, thinning out the center of this, just and part of this comes with the stylization of your Atlal, depending on how stylized you want it. So I just started a little well there. I made it really thin here, so I don't want to get too carried away here with the well, but and what I'm doing is, with this, I'm just kind of angle cutting this. Cut it one direction, and then I cut it down the other to really make that spur really pronounced there. And of course you could probably use sandpaper too if you'd like to get smooth out some of the rough edges here. I did not actually grab sandpaper for this, but now I'm kind of regretting it because I would like to actually smooth this out a little bit. But that's certainly something that is worth doing if you really want to get a sharp looking piece. But right now I'm just trying to round it off as much as I can, just using the knife. It doesn't look too bad. So you can see what I've done here is I've created a little notch here, a little knock. That spur, that's what's going to be resting in the back end of our dart here. So, and this probably is going to be sufficient, I think, for working. Ultimately, you want it to hold the back end of the dart while you hold your Atlal at the other end. And it looks like this is actually going to work. This would actually work fairly well. And you'd actually use this then to propel your missile here, your dart, at a greater velocity and a greater force than you'd be able to by throwing it by hand. And you use the Atlal, it's kind of like a hammer, but I kind of envision it like it's kind of like throwing a football, you know, as far as the motion as when you're casting your dart. So I think barring making any aesthetic adjustments to this, I think we have a decent enough Atlal here that it's functional. You can of course play around with it as much as you like and make it look however you'd like. But let's focus now on making our dart. So this will be our dart. This will be our shaft here. This is just river cane. We're going to insert a point in one end, and then we're going to attach some fletching to the other so that it'll be kind of like an arrow in its design, but obviously it's going to be about 6 feet long. And we call it a dart because it's got some flexion. It's kind of like an arrow as opposed to a spear. A spear would be rather rigid and would be more for thrusting or more like a javelin. So let's start working on. To start with, I'm going to start with the point. So you can either sometimes I use a saw and I just cut a little notch in the distal end of our dart to seat our point, but this actually had split. I think it's because I had it in my car. So I'm actually going to use the split itself, and that's another way. You can actually use a split to actually insert your dart point. So I'm going to try to do this carefully without actually making it split further. I'm going to actually wrap it with the sinew, so that will give it a little bit more. It'll make it so it won't actually split apart on this necessarily. So I'm just going to insert this as best I can. And we do know archaeologically that from the ones that have been preserved, you actually see them either way. So there will be either just split or they'll actually be kind of notched in there. All right, so I've got some artificial sinew here, and I'm going to have a piece of that. And what you're going to do here, so there are little notches on our point where you want this basically to you're going to use those notches to essentially secure your point. And I'm just going to wrap it around a couple times here first, and then like so. I'm just going to wrap it around like so. And then I'm actually going to take it up. There's 2 little shoulders here on the point. I'm actually going to start taking it up over the shoulders in a figure 8 pattern. So I'm going to take it up and down, around, and then up the other side, down, around. And I'm just going to keep doing that pattern. We're going to take it up and around. And oftentimes these points are ground on the side so that you can do that. So it wouldn't actually cut the sinew. And that's just to secure it fast to your dart, your shaft here, so it wouldn't actually dislodge itself. Although sometimes these were actually sometimes it's actually part of a foreshaft, and I'm actually going to wrap it around the shaft here a little bit more because it is split. That would actually secure it a little bit better. And I'm actually going to use some of the hot glue to secure the ends here. Traditionally, we would use like a resin or something of that sort, pine resin, something like that to actually secure it. Hot glue is just an easy modern alternative that essentially simulates what was traditionally available. So that secures it more or less. There is a little bit of play in it, but it secures it more or less. So now we can actually work on on our hafting. And I have some feathers here that we're going to use for the hafting. To begin with, what we're going to do is we're going to have to split the feathers down the shaft so that we can actually secure them to the back end of our dart like so. So we'll have to remove that bottom part of the feathers so that we can actually seat these securely on the proximal end of our okay, dart. So I'm just going to use the utility knife here to split the quill here. And it doesn't necessarily have to be split down the middle, it just has to be somewhat flattened on one side. And you want to remove all these feathers here because those will otherwise be in the way. Okay, so that's more or less going to work. I'm just going to smooth out some of the ridges here. You want it to be somewhat even so that it will sit relatively securely on your shaft. Securing them to the shaft can be somewhat challenging, so you want to try to make it as easy as possible on yourself so you won't have additional challenges trying to secure it. And I'm just going to do this, repeat this process then for all of our feathers here. Okay, I kind of ruffled that feather a little bit, no pun intended, but I'm just going to re-fluff it here a little bit. And these feathers I just got from Hobby Lobby. You can get different sizes. Of course, you want an appropriate size for your fletching for a dart system. So I usually don't necessarily go with a particular type of feather. I just go for what it looks like is going to be about the right size for the fletching. So I'm just going to fluff it just a little bit again. We're actually going to be running the sinew through it anyway, so if it doesn't quite look as nice and neat as it did originally, it's not a problem. And the fletching is actually really the most challenging part of the dart because it takes a lot of coordination and a lot of patience. So I do this oftentimes with children. You can imagine the challenges I get with that. Okay, so we got our feathers ready. So now it's time to secure them, and I'm going to and you want to keep actually this part here on because that actually is going to be how we're going to actually work on securing. We're going to wrap the sinew around that part. So this is the part that I find the most challenging, is trying to hold these in place. Actually, you'll want to get your sinew ready first. because we'll want to secure them in place, because it's, I usually use 4 feathers. Okay, so I'm just going to hold the feathers in place for now, and you can hold them bunched together, because we're actually going to have to wrap it first, the one end, and then we're going to actually adjust them into their places once we get this relatively secure here. So I'm just going to start by wrapping the sinew. I'm going to actually tie it off here to start with, and then I'll wrap it. Okay. Okay, so I'm just going to tie this off here. And there's no trick to the knot, it's just to hold it in place basically so that I can start wrapping it. I'm not going to worry about where they lie just yet. I'm going to just wrap this with the sinew here on this end. I'm going to wrap it several times here because I ultimately need this to stay in place so I can properly adjust the feathers. So I wrapped it a couple times. I think it's probably good now, so I can actually adjust the feathers. So there's have 4 feathers that I've placed on here. I'm going to slide them around until they relatively evenly distributed around the shaft, around the cane here. You could also use a fletching jig if you have one. I do have one, I just don't have it here, but I do find it a little easier sometimes. It basically just gives you an extra hand, which is really what you need when you're doing this work. But I've got it more or less kind of even around the shaft here. I'm just going to continue wrapping the sinew around the end here, and then eventually I'm going to take them up through the feathers. Now, some people when they fletch, they actually just wrap this end here and then the other end, like so, just holding it in place. These have a little bit of warp in them though, and so I'm going to need to actually wrap it around in through the feathers in order to secure the shaft of the feather to the shaft of my dart. And I'm just going to use the natural breaks in the feathers. I'm just going to find an area where I'm not like pressing down the feathers too much, but you will to some extent have to, but that's okay if you do. It will still fly. It just needs doesn't need the full feather necessarily to do that. But it definitely does need the fletching. If you've ever tried shooting an arrow without fletching, or when the fletching has fallen off, you will know that you get some really crazy trajectories on the arrow. So I've come up to the end. I'm just going to wrap it around the other end then, a number of times, just like I did the other end. And the feathers have shifted on me a little bit, so I'm just going to make the final adjustments here. I'm just going to slide them around into place where I want them. Make sure they're somewhat even. They don't have to be exact by any means, because they'll still provide the stability in flight. but you definitely don't want them all bunched up on one side either, because then it'd be like having no fletching at all. And there you go. So I've got them relatively evenly distributed on the far side, and then that completes our dart, and it's actually ready to cast with our Atlal. And to do that, you would hook the back end, the hollow end of your dart in your Atlal, and you would use your Atlal then to cast the dart.